about that.
Oh, okay. So let me go back to 4 really quick, because there were 2 other things I wanted to talk about with my more recent games.
Okay.
Because I talked about Kaiser. Sorry, I talked about Kaiser. Here, I'm just going to highlight it so I remember which one I'm on.
Okay.
I talked about Kaiser and how people had hacked my game and showed me how they could like reverse engineer it and helped me to obfuscate the code, or kind of forced me to learn about that. With my next game, Taking Mars, like I said, I only got to a beta stage, but that did have some online functionality, and that had a kind of a top 10 list, or like some top lists, and people were able to show me where I had made some mistakes in my server coding or programming, and how they were able to enter the server and adjust certain things in the database without me wanting them to.
Mm-hmm.
I learned very quickly about like escape characters and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
An escape character, I'm sure you probably already know this, but just for reference, an escape character is some character or group of characters that you can put into an input field, especially when you're dealing with a database or maybe a search query or something like that. Like you go onto Google and you search for potatoes, maybe something like that. But if you put in maybe like \n colon F or 4C or something like that, that's not an escape character, because I can't remember what they are right now. But if you put in a special group of characters, sometimes that will allow you to interact with the backend, with like the programming side of a input field or database or function of some kind. This is especially prevalent with PHP because it's a terrible, very unsecure language, but that's okay. But yeah, this is a very, very common, especially with certain types of programming languages that kind of expect you to deal with that. So if, for example, like my computer game, Taking Mars, at the end of a game, it would look for certain attributes, certain things that might say this person should be on the leaderboard, and then it would connect to the server and try to upload those scores and that information to the leaderboard. But my players used the network sniffer, packet sniffer. There we go. They used the packet sniffer, or they watched their network basically, and they were able to see where my server was, and so they knew the IP address, and they also saw the type of message that was being sent to my server, and they kind of copied the same idea, or copied the general structure of the message, but they also input some of these escape characters so that they could get into the actual back end of the system and change the high score list, basically. And so I was able to pretty quickly figure out how to stop them from using these escape characters and stop them from accessing the database. But this, of course, could be much, much worse if I had implemented like some kind of credit card system or payment system without knowing about this kind of thing, and they were able to access credit card information and passwords for all my other players.
Yes.
So, so yeah, there's those, and then. Yeah, okay, and then so I did that, but that game was mostly only connecting to a server at the end of a game, not during a game. People were able to play locally against each other, but not remotely against each other. So my newest game, Kaiser Redux, it allows for people to play against each other at the same time. Synchronously or synchronously or asynchronously. Yeah. So they can play like I take a turn and then you immediately take a turn and I take a turn, et cetera, or asynchronously where I take a turn and then there's a notification for you that you have a turn waiting and you can play today, tomorrow, the next day, a month from now, and then it comes back to me, just like asynchronous chess or something like that. I had to learn a lot more about obviously, I had to learn a lot more about security for this kind of purpose, because when you have people playing against each other, the amount of times you interact with the server is much, much higher. And you're using different types of messages and database structures and things like that, so that you can create a very performant kind of system, because that's very important, is people don't have a lot of lag between their turns, things like that. This, I didn't come into any problems or security incidents while this was happening, because I was still playing with people that I trusted, or a very small group of people, to test this. But I was able to find a few security flaws of my own, typically through some sort of, usually it's because the server functions, or the server program that like checks the information coming from the client, was not robust enough. It wasn't looking for all the correct things that it should have been, and so perhaps a player was able to make a move that was not actually legal, but the server didn't. The server saw it as just a perfectly fine move, and so there's things where you have to deal with a lot more like client server synchronicity. They should be in the same kind of game state, and you have to be very careful of that, because, that could, if a player is able to basically hack their multiplayer experience, then the player they're playing against sees them as cheating, and then they might not want to come back and play the game again. So that becomes a much more difficult or more complex issue. But I think we get into that in a question later on, so I'll come back to that. Okay, I think that's 4 and 5.
Okay, so 5. There is no any security measure you need to add to 5, right? So,
nope, okay. I don't think so. I think mostly online stuff now.
Yeah. So let us move to question number 6. Based on your game design experience, what are the security measures needed to develop a secure online single-player computer game that mitigates cybersecurity risk, and why are those security measures needed?
Okay. Obfuscation, again, I think that's probably... it's not necessary, but it's probably, like, all of these aren't necessary technically, but they are probably highly recommended, extremely highly recommended. And obfuscation is probably one of the most highly recommended ones, just because it makes the life of the hacker much more difficult, with very little cost to the developer, typically. Okay, so obviously payment information is something that you really have to be very vigilant about, and that's probably the main one, like profile management, which profile management and payment information is kind of should be kind of combined, essentially. So when you start dealing with passwords, let's say, so password, words, and encryption. So encryption is probably the major idea from here going forward, or for basically all the rest of the questions and things like that. Okay, the idea is, and I'm sure you already know quite a bit of this, but with encryption, you have to make sure that you obviously have to make sure that your server is secure, because if people are able to get into your server, then you can lose a lot of your passwords and encryption that way, although that's not the end of the world as long as you salt your passwords. This is a lot of combined ideas, but essentially the player should have a password and create a profile that is then sent to the server. The server then salts the password, which basically means that it, using a unique token that is set up by the developer, so like the developer's own, let's call it password, for all client passwords, but that password will not be preferably on the server. I've found that you can do it with one server, but that also means that if that server is breached, you have a much higher likelihood of losing all the passwords. And let me try to organize my thoughts really quick.
That's fine. Take your time. That's fine.
because there's a lot of like interlocking
Yes.
parts to this.
Yes.
Let's see. Okay, let me just generally start with encryption. Encryption is the ability to take some string or number, string meaning like a set of characters together, and change it so that, and using some other functions, you change it so that it is not what it originally was, but it can be decoded. Essentially, you're coding it into something, as in like a secret code, but it can be decoded using another kind of password. This general idea is known as salting, basically, and so the developer needs a password to salt all passwords, and then I'm sure there's a lot more like technical words for this, but like I think I said earlier, or like when we were talking on messengers and stuff, I learned all this by myself. Yes. So I definitely don't have a professional background in this.
That's fine.
Or like an educated background, I should say, in this. So the player makes a password on their clients.
Okay.
The password, trying to remember. The password itself is not sent in clear text to the server, because that's a bad idea.
So are you trying to it's sent encrypted to the server?
Yeah, you have to encrypt the password first on the client side and then send it to the server.
Okay, I see what.
Then it can be decrypted on the server and salted, and then stored in the database. But yeah, okay, I'll come back to that. And then that way, whenever the client logs in again in the future, they send their encrypted password to the server. The server checks it against they unsalt? I forget what the term is. Maybe it's unsalt. They unsalt the password in the database. They check, or no. They never unsalt. They salt the password that is sent. The encrypted password is sent to the server. The server decrypts the password. The password is salted and checked against the salted password in the database. There we go.
Okay.
It's complicated. It's been a little while since I did stuff.
That's fine.
Yeah, a couple of years actually now. And yeah, because you don't generally desalt the password. That's just a really bad idea. Okay, and that's how you check, basically. And usually for like the main password for a profile, let's say, the profile that contains all the billing information and payment information, all that kind of stuff, that is a very strongly encrypted password. And both on the sending end from client to server, and also especially when it's salted and stored in the database. The one that you would want to use, you want to use a slightly smaller or less intense encryption method when you're doing the one on the client computer, especially because for games like I make, they're typically mobile games, or they can be used as mobile games. And so the computer hardware that you have access to is much less. It's not as strong, basically. Like the CPU is not as strong, the GPU is not as strong, things like that. And so you want to use different encryption methods. Okay, getting into encryption methods. There are a variety of them. The one that I typically have found to be the most useful is called AES. This is a pretty well-known one. Yes. I think there's even like AES 32 and 64, but those are considered extremely weak and can be, what's the term? Where you just hammer it over and over and over until you get it.
Take a lot of processing time?
Well, like if a hacker wanted to figure out this password, they could just keep trying many different versions. Yeah, but anyway, so, okay, never mind. I'll get back to this. But AES 32 and 64, I think these exist, but they're just not very popular because they're very, very simple, or they're a little too easy to reverse. Let's call it reverse engineer, basically. So you typically would not want to, even on a mobile device, you wouldn't want to do 32 and 64 because although they're very fast to encode, and that's the biggest difference as we move up from 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, etc. They're very, very fast to encode and decode or decrypt, encrypt and decrypt. There we go. They're very insecure.
I see. So you prefer to use AES alone without 60, right?
AES 128 is what I would use for client-server communications. Mm-hmm. But even this is getting a little outdated now. It's a little too easy to crack this, especially if you have somebody in, for example, and I don't mean to pick on China or Russia, but they are the ones that have the most prevalent histories with this. If you have server farms in Russia or China, which are much cheaper, especially in China, you have server farms of people who just have these computers going all day long trying to figure out a password or to reverse engineer some code of some kind. 128 is not too difficult. From what I remember, it can take a server farm, a small to mid-sized server farm, maybe like 30 minutes to do 128, something like that. It might be 3 days. I don't know. It was a while since I looked into this, but and I'm sure it's even faster now because it's like I said, it's been 1 or 2 years since I looked into this. So pace of progress and all that. So I would probably, if I were like now I'm doing it, or like when I go back to Kaiser and I go back into my networking, I'll probably go with 256 between client and server. This is a significant toll, especially on lower end devices. Like I keep my phone is a very old phone. It's a pretty old phone. And I know that it would probably take a good amount of time to encrypt the password every time it does it to go to 256. 128 is not too bad for like just a device like this, but 256 is, from what I understand, it's exponentially more difficult. And so it could take a significant amount of time. But again, and that could certain customers would probably not like that, especially customers on older devices. But newer devices, that shouldn't be a problem. Like iPhone 10 would probably have no problem doing 256 in a very short amount of time. But on the server side, you want something very strong, very, very strong. But like I said, this is all like exponentially more powerful. And so 512 is probably going to be perfectly fine. Yeah, but this does take quite a lot of processing power. And so, and especially if you have a large group of players or a large player base, this can get quite expensive because you're using your server time for encryption encryption, from what I understand, is not too difficult. Decryption is more costly. Or maybe it's the opposite way. I don't know. I forget right now. But either way, this can be pretty costly for your server when you want your server to be serving your game, not just the passwords and encryption all the time.
So you prefer the encryption only for the password or for any other information?
Well, the password is like the key, essentially, basically just for the password for the profile. The profile is like, you can imagine the profile is like a box, and the password is the key to get into the box.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yes.
So as long as you have the key, you can open the box and get into the profile.
Yes.
However, credit card numbers should also be salted or encrypted as well. And usually, for the best practice, you should salt the credit card information with a different key than you used for the passwords themselves. That way, it makes it extra difficult. Even if somebody finds your key to unsalt the passwords, they still can't get to the credit card information without getting a second key.
I see what you mean, yes.
Yeah, so for every level of very important information, like here's the box for the profile, and then there's another box with credit card information, maybe another box with another box with their personal profile connections, like Google or Facebook or something like that, should be kept in its own kind of secure state or box within a box. Each of those should have their own individual keys or tokens? Not tokens. I can't remember the terms. I'm very bad at terms. Sorry. Anyway, so yeah, for each individual important group of information, it should have its own unique key for salting in particular. Yeah, okay, let's see. What else? Let me go back to 6 really quick, read through this. Okay, these are pretty self-explanatory in terms of why they're needed, because if somebody has access to these, then they have basically access to the person's financial information, which is not good. Okay, what other security measures? Let me think really quick.
Yeah, take your time.
Oh, yeah, okay, so the profile, not only would it have like profile information under that key, you have a subsection for the credit card info and financial info, subsection for real world data, like their Facebook account or something like that. But you, of course, also have another subsection for content purchased through the app, through the game, whatever it happens to be. And you do want to keep that separate from your financial information as well. Again, just having more of these subsections with their own unique keys is going to just make it even harder for. It's a very small time commitment from the developer, but it creates an exponentially more difficult problem for the hacker as well, having all these subsections with unique keys. So you want to, of course, have this for rights management. Like, did a person have download some DLC, downloadable content, basically, extra downloadable content like extra maps or extra heroes or whatever it happens to be in a certain game. Maybe some cosmetics, some hats or some clothes that they bought with their money. So you want to use this for digital rights management. Does the person actually own the game? How much of the game do they own? Do they own extra parts of the game? Things like that. So that is, of course, very, very helpful because of what we talked about earlier with digital rights management, especially with online games.
Yes.
And there are, I should also mention, there are other forms of encryption. AES just happens to be like probably the most prevalent one, and for my experience, it's the easiest one to understand and to implement. But there are others. I don't know their names. It's been a while since I looked into them. And there are even more experimental ones because of... okay, I'm going to get more theoretical for a second, but it is a very... I'd say a very good thing to think about for the future, which are quantum computers, which are going to be much more prevalent going forward. And quantum computers are, of course, computers that work on a quantum level. They don't use transistors in the traditional sense like we use right now, which can even have either have an on or an off state, a 0 or a 1 state, which is how we create bits and bytes and all that other thing, information that way. Quantum computers use on-off and on-off, a indeterminate state, for allowing for a 3-state byte, bit. There we go. Yeah, for a 3-state bit. This alone allows them to do a significant amount more processing with the amount of energy necessary. So this basically just destroys all old encryption methods. A quantum computer, I forget, again, it was a while ago when I was researching this, but a quantum computer could reverse engineer a 256 AES password within like maybe 30 minutes or something like that by itself, just one computer.
Okay.
Extremely powerful, and a 512 in maybe 3 days or something, whereas a server farm would take like 30 days or a month to do 512, something like that. So that is something that we have to keep in mind as we move forward, is that quantum computers, and unfortunately, especially in places that we might not want them to become very prevalent, like China. I have nothing against China. I love China I like it quite. but there is a lot of hacking and
yes, and Russia as well. Yeah,
and things like that go on in that country.
yeah.
And so as we move forward, even in the next 10 years, we'll have to be very, very cautious of that. We'll have to move on to some kind of quantum security tokens or quantum servers or something like that in order to just keep up with keeping hackers out of our own servers. So this will raise the price of servers and of creating online games in general, especially if you don't want them hacked. So I have my own theories about that, but that doesn't seem like that's for this kind of this forum right now. But that is something that we have to be very, very mindful of, and that's probably the single most significant factor moving forward for security, I would say, is quantum computers becoming super prevalent and just destroying all old encryption methods. Yep. There are definitely ways around that, okay, wait, a single online player game. Okay, yep. I just remembered a few other methods. Okay, so getting off of the theoretical stuff, and I want to quickly check, can you hear me and all that?
Yes. Everything is okay. I'm listening to everything.
Okay, well, because mine said it was a poor connection, so I just wanted to check, make sure. Okay, so there are, once we're talking about online single-player games or any game with a server, there are lots of other server-related security breaches that can happen. And I remembered a few. One of them's a man-in-the-middle attack. This is a type of attack where if somebody sends information to a server, there could be someone in the middle, and this is the reason why we encrypt the passwords on the client end before we send them to the server, is because there can always be somebody in the middle who intercepts the password and decrypt it, or a few other things, like they can also pretend to be that client and then keep that message moving forward to the server, and the server doesn't realize there's a person in the middle and sends some information back. It can be very simple information, just like a credit card confirmation, which is not too significant. Granted, it tells them what kind of credit card they use and things like that, which is not good, or what bank they use. But it can also be much more serious, because that person can then, from then on, pretend to be this client, which is a problem, because not only we encrypt the password and send it to the server, but if the man in the middle gets this and they get the encrypted password, then they essentially have the password, basically. Yeah. Which then becomes a problem.
Of course.
Granted, they would need some kind of custom software or custom functions to be able to interact with the server directly with their computer. And that's when you start doing multiple, or you layer on authentication methods for when you're interacting between a client and a server. So not only would the client just be sending the password and things like that, they would probably have some kind of unique identifier for their device that's also associated with some real world timely factor, usually like the time, or so very briefly, an idea would be if they want to send the profile information, or they want to log in. Let's say they want to log in. There's always ways around that, but when they log in, there will be a time associated with when the password was encrypted and sent to the server. The time itself would probably also be encrypted in some way, probably with its own unique encryption method or a key. And that key would also be associated directly with the client, and that would be associated on the first time that the game is started. There's a lot of things that would happen the first time a game is started just to make sure that, or just to create unique identifiers, basically. And the packet or the content that is sent is then sent, but even if there is a man-in-the-middle attack, the server might realize that there is something wrong with the time stamp.
Yes,
there we go. With the time stamp associated with it. It might then send a response to make sure that the client is the client, or it could also just like stop the
session or
the connection then, or something like that, or send them an email to confirm or something like that. But it would then usually send back some like a unique identifier, especially from when the client was first started up and first connected to the server. It would send back a unique identifier to check with the client if it is the true client. And that gets pretty complicated. It can be copied. And again, there's no way around, or there's no such thing as perfect security. But especially if you do things like creating unique identifiers at the startup or the first time that the game is run, that can help. But again, if there is a man in the middle from the first time you start up the game ever and then send it off to the client or to the server, there's just always going to be a bad link there, a bad connection. There's other methods for getting around that. I can't remember what they are right now, and they get kind of complicated. But something similar to that, usually creating unique tokens or identifiers and trying to match them. There's also having a server, of course, opens you up to lots of server-based attacks, just direct attacks on the server, not even going through the client. DDoS attacks. There we go. I'm trying to remember what those are called for a while. Denial of... I forget what the first D is for.
Denial of service attack.
Yeah, but I thought there was a first D, dedicated denial of service attack.
I think that you can. I think that, but in general they call it denial of service attack.
Yep.
Yeah, when you flood. Yeah.
Yeah, you essentially flood the server with connections, even if they're not even trying to connect. It's just like you're pinging it so often that the server can't actually do anything. There are pretty quick ways to get around denial of service attacks. Or at least generic ones, because generic denial of service attacks would just be like one server farm or a few IP addresses all flooding the server at once. And if the server realizes this, especially if they're not trying to connect with authentic methods, they would just block those IPs. Or you could even take it a step further, and if you have a good relationship with your service provider, your IP provider, you could contact your service provider, and through the server, you could contact them and tell them that there's a denial of service attack coming in from these IP addresses, and they themselves would just block those. They would firewall those, and there's just you wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Your server wouldn't have to be the one firewalling. So there are certainly ways around that, but really good DDoS attacks, the ones that we do see coming out of Russia and China, are using typically the clients. And again, this goes back to that illegal redistribution, because they get a hold of these clients and then they change them for whatever purpose, but usually to get credit card information, and then they redistribute them on their own platforms or their own country's platforms. And then at some point, maybe if I'm the developer and I realize, there's this illegal version of my game out there that's trying to collect all these credit cards, I got to stop that. They can then turn these clients into attacking machines just to retaliate essentially against me, or for many other purposes. But I would guess that's probably a pretty classic example. And those machines then. That's a very difficult problem, because their clients, they are people who do want to play your game, but their client itself has been breached. So whether they know it or not, they are now attacking your system. So you firewall them, and you typically firewall them forever. So you lose those clients, even if they were good clients and they would have paid, and if they went through these methods to get your game, but unfortunately they just got the wrong version or a illegal version. So now you've lost a client, you've lost that money, and you can never have them again.
Yes.
That's a big problem, especially in those countries, because those countries in particular they love mobile games and that kind of stuff in general. Like China is 1.4 billion people. Russia has a pretty large, it's about the same size as America.
They're large. They are a large country, huge.
300 million people, something like that.
Yeah, it's a large country, yes. I don't know how much, but it's a large country, yes.
Yeah, and a lot of them, especially, actually some of my testers were from St. Petersburg as well. They were the ones that were telling me about some of the problems with my servers. Yeah. Very, very nice people. Yeah. They're also extremely technically savvy.
Of course, well. Yes. They are well known. Russian well known in ITs. Yeah.
Exactly. So if that's a real shame because they're the type of people who are very likely to play your games and things like that. Especially my kind of games, they're more technical, kind of heady, very like chess and things like that. Obviously, Russians love chess, so that would make me very sad if I firewalled a bunch of people who really love the game.
Yes.
So that's a big problem for games like mine. Maybe for more casual games, it's not that big of a deal. It's a cost benefit analysis, but that can be a big problem for smaller games like mine. And any kind of DDoS attack against a small game like mine would be very, very, very significant.
Yes.
Not so much for bigger games, obviously. But luckily those are pretty easy to fight against. There are more significant ones, like if they do or are using clients and they are using real credentials, then it can take a